Some people look at you and see an obstacle. They never stop to ask whether you might be the road. The night they decided I wasn't good enough for the man I loved was the same night they handed me every reason I needed to remind them exactly who I was. If you have ever walked into a room and felt people decide your worth before you even opened your mouth, stay with me, because this story is for you. Hit that like button right now, subscribe if you're new here, and I promise you, the moment these people found out what they had actually been dealing with all along, you will not want to miss it. My name is Flora. I was born in Accra, raised in Atlanta, and by the time I was 29, I had quietly built something most people spend their entire careers chasing. I didn't come from money. I came from a mother who ironed her uniform before every single shift and still found time to sit with me at the kitchen table every night and say, "Flora, baby, you don't wait for anybody to open a door for you. You build the whole building." I took that woman's words, and I ran with them for the next 2 decades. I met Sungmin at a private investment conference in Singapore, the kind of room where you had to earn your seat just to stand at the buffet table. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, and in a room full of people doing exactly that, it stopped me completely. He was standing near the window, reading something on his phone with his jacket folded over his arm, completely unbothered by the performance happening around him. I ended up next to him at a panel discussion neither of us had planned to attend, and we talked until the hotel staff started stacking chairs around us. He was brilliant without being loud about it, warm without being careless. He asked questions like he actually wanted the answers, not like he was waiting for his own turn to speak. We talked about everything that evening and somehow never got around to talking about what we actually did for a living, which felt, at the time, like the most refreshing conversation I'd had in years. What followed wasn't fast or flashy. It was built slowly, the way things are built when 2 people are actually paying attention. He flew to Atlanta twice before I came to Seoul. We cooked bad food together in his small apartment and watched thunderstorms from his balcony, and he made me feel, for the first time in a very long time, like being simply myself was not just acceptable, but genuinely enough. He proposed on an ordinary Wednesday. No restaurant booking, no hidden photographer. Just the 2 of us in his kitchen after dinner, the dishes still on the counter, him turning to me with a ring he'd apparently been carrying for 3 weeks because he kept talking himself out of the timing, and then realized, as he told me later, that waiting for the perfect moment was a way of pretending there was something more perfect than the life we were already living. I cried before he even got the full question out. I should have known that for certain people, a love that quiet and that solid would feel like an insult. Sungmin's inner circle had existed long before I arrived, and they intended for it to continue existing in exactly the same shape after I showed up. The invitation to dinner at Murray's apartment came 3 weeks after our engagement was announced. Sungmin held my hand in the car and told me they were going to love me. I smiled and said I was sure they would. I had been walking into rooms that didn't want me my entire life. I knew how to read a welcome that wasn't one. There were 5 of them. Murray, Sungmin's closest friend since university, all sharp angles and careful elegance, the kind of woman who had decided long before I arrived what category I belonged in. Dohan, Sungmin's business partner, who greeted me with a handshake that lasted exactly long enough to be polite and a look that said nothing behind it. Soyeon, Dohan's wife, whose smile reached everywhere except her eyes. Jinhee, a childhood friend whose warmth I couldn't quite trust because it arrived too quickly and adjusted too easily depending on who was watching. And Kangwoo, quiet, watchful, always slightly apart from the group in a way that I filed away and kept. The microaggressions began before we had finished the first course. Murray, addressing Soyeon but pitching her voice at the whole table, said that Sungmin had always had what she called an adventurous spirit. She let the word adventurous sit in the air exactly long enough for everyone to understand what she meant by it. A few people reached for their glasses. Someone asked about the wine. I picked up my chopsticks. I looked at Murray with the most settled expression I have ever worn in my life. I had sat in boardrooms where men twice her age tried similar maneuvers. I had survived every single one of them, but I remembered every word she said. I always do. There was another moment later in the evening. Jinhee asked me, with the kind of theatrical innocence that takes real practice to perfect, whether I found it difficult, adjusting to a different culture. She glanced around the table as she said it, checking the room the way you do when you want an audience for a punchline. I told her calmly that I found it about as difficult as any thoughtful person finds any meaningful new experience. Sungmin's hand found mine under the table. I gave it the smallest squeeze and moved on. We were married on a Saturday in late autumn, in a small ceremony that was entirely and deliberately ours. My mother arrived 4 days early. She walked into our apartment in Seoul, took one long look around the room, studied Sungmin for a long, quiet moment, and then looked at me with eyes that carried everything she didn't need to say out loud. That night, while Sungmin was on the phone with his sister, she pulled me into the kitchen and whispered, "That man looks at you like you're the whole answer, Flora." I held onto those words all the way to the ceremony. Sungmin's grandmother, Halmoni Chungsuk, 76 years old and carrying herself with the kind of stillness that only comes from having already survived everything difficult, embraced me the morning of the wedding and said something in Korean that Sungmin later translated as "Our family is fuller now." I carried that too. The ceremony was small and honest, exactly the way we wanted it. Sungmin cried before I reached him and didn't seem remotely troubled by that fact. I made it to the third step before I started as well. Murray sat on the left side in a cream dress that was, if you were paying attention, just a shade too bridal. Dohan applauded at all the right moments with the mechanical precision of someone performing cheerfulness rather than feeling it. Soyeon photographed most of the reception on her phone, which I suppose was efficient. Then came the toasts. Murray stood and delivered 4 minutes of the most technically constructed cruelty I have ever witnessed in a social setting. Every sentence was wrapped in the language of celebration. Every implication landed somewhere colder. Half the room laughed along easily. The other half shifted in their seats without quite knowing why. My mother, front row, heard every syllable. She reached under the table and took my hand. I held hers back with everything I had. Sungmin glowed through the entire thing, radiant in the way that only happens when someone is genuinely, completely happy. I loved him for it, but I noticed what he didn't. The look that passed between Murray and Kangwoo during our first dance. The way Dohan watched us with something behind his smile that had nothing to do with goodwill. Something was already being assembled, quietly, inside the warmth of the celebration. It took 11 weeks. Sungmin flew to Tokyo for a series of meetings that were going to keep him occupied for 10 days. The morning after his flight, Murray called. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "An olive branch," she said. A girls' lunch, just the two of them, a genuine beginning. I knew precisely what it was. I went anyway, because you do not understand the full shape of something until you let it show itself completely. The restaurant was the kind of place that communicates power through its very quietness. Private, unhurried, expensive in the way that isn't announced. I walked in expecting Murray. What I found was all of them arranged around a circular table with the careful deliberateness of people who had rehearsed the geometry. Murray, Dohan, Soyeon, Jinhee, Kangwoo, no menus in sight. No opening pleasantries, just 5 people and the specific stillness that settles over a room when everyone in it believes they are about to win. Dohan spoke first. His tone was measured and nearly kind, the particular register of someone who has practiced their cruelty until it sounds almost like concern. He said that Sungmin came from a world with certain expectations, that families like theirs had responsibilities to lineage and continuity, that I was, in his exact phrasing, a complication that was only going to deepen. He said staying was, in fact, the selfish thing to do. He said all of this looking directly at me the way people look at a problem they are solving. Soyeon slid a document across the table. Crisp pages, precise figures, a drafted settlement with terms already written and spaces left for signatures. They had come with paperwork. I looked down at it. I looked back up. And then Murray leaned forward and said slowly, with full deliberate weight behind every syllable, "We know where you came from, Flora. We all do. You should be grateful Sungmin even noticed you." Table went completely still. And then, from behind me, came the sound of low heels on marble. Halmoni Chungsuk, 76 years old, white hair perfectly set, moving with the unhurried authority of a woman who has already decided, walked past me, looked directly at Murray, and said in Korean, clear and final, words that Sungmin later told me translated simply as, "You have embarrassed this family for the last time." Table didn't move. I stood up slowly. I smoothed my jacket. I looked at each of them one at a time without hurry. "You should have done your research," I said. Then I pulled out my phone, opened a single document, and set it on the table in front of Do-han. He picked it up the way people pick things up when they still believe they are the most important person in the room. He read the first paragraph. Then his hand went absolutely still. Kestrel Pacific Holdings, the private investment firm that held a controlling stake in his company's primary licensing structure. The entity that had quietly shaped 2 years of his biggest contracts, his most significant approvals, the financial architecture he had built his recent success on top of. That entity was mine. I had been his most important business relationship before I was ever his colleague's fiancé. He simply never thought to ask who was actually on the other side of it. I watched the certainty leave his face. Not all at once. Steadily, the way a tide pulls back from shore, then I turned to Soyeon. The design collective she referenced at every dinner, the one she flew to Milan to attend each season, the one whose pieces she treated as a proxy for her own taste and identity. I had co-founded it 9 years earlier under a holding company. It existed, in the form she loved it, because of decisions I had made long before I ever stepped into her life. Her expression didn't shift so much as dissolve. Murray was next. The wellness brand she had spent 14 months cultivating toward a major retail partnership, the doors she believed were opening on their own momentum. Those doors ran through a licensing committee. I had been a senior member of that committee for 4 years. Every approval she had received, and every future one she was counting on, had passed across my desk. And then I looked at Kangwoo, the quiet one, the watchful one. I told him I had been aware for 6 weeks that proprietary strategy from Sungmin's company had been reaching a direct competitor. I told him I had the messages. I told him I had waited because timing, in business as in life, is the difference between noise and consequence. The table sat in complete silence. 5 people who had walked in holding every card and were now sitting with nothing but the slow, nauseating understanding that they had spent months looking directly at the most consequential person in the room and seen only what they assumed. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it matters. What followed was not about anger. Anger is reactive. It moves too fast and leaves marks it didn't intend to leave. What I did was considered, measured, and no larger than what was warranted. I simply stopped shielding people who had never once thought to shield me. Do-han felt it first. A refinancing structure he had been building toward for nearly a year collapsed when a key board declined to move forward. The letter cited strategic realignment. No phone call, no detailed explanation. He called Sungmin, confused and increasingly desperate. Sungmin, who by then knew everything, did not pick up. Within 6 weeks, Do-han's formal partnership with Sungmin was dissolved. He told people it was a mutual restructuring. It was not. Soyeon's unraveling arrived quietly and completely. The collective she had wrapped her entire public identity around removed her from its VIP registry with a standard administrative notice. Her seasonal invitations stopped. Her name was absent from events she had attended for years. No one called to explain. A form letter arrived the way form letters do, without ceremony and without apology. Murray held on the longest, which made it worse for her. She spent weeks making calls that were not returned and sending emails that received automated responses and pursuing a retail partnership that had, without announcement or drama, simply ceased to be available to her. The infrastructure of the life she had built so carefully began coming undone at precisely the points where she had felt most secure. Kangwoo's situation required nothing further from me. The evidence went to Sungmin, then to legal counsel, and then entirely beyond my involvement. The quiet, watchful one became the subject of a formal investigation that removed every comfort his carefulness had been built to protect. One evening, Sungmin found me on the balcony with a book I wasn't really reading and came to stand beside me for a long time before speaking. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I should have seen more of it sooner." I closed the book and turned to look at him. "You loved them," I said. "That's not a flaw, that is exactly who you are." 6 months later, the shape of our life looked different. Not loudly, not dramatically, just cleaner. Like a space after someone has removed everything from it that was never meant to be there. The Kestrel Pacific Holdings annual foundation gala was held in April, a large and genuinely purposeful evening, the kind that fills a room with people who are actually doing something meaningful with what they have. Sungmin and I arrived together. And for the first time since I had entered this particular version of the world, My name appeared on the printed program not as his wife, not as a guest, but as the lead benefactor. As Flora. As myself. My mother was visiting that week. She sat at our table in a deep green dress, posture perfect, eyes moving through the room the way she has always moved through every room, reading, measuring, deciding. At some point during the evening, she leaned close and said simply, "Now this is the right room, baby." I didn't answer. I just took her hand and held it on top of the table openly where anyone who looked could see. No hiding, no squeezing underneath anything. Just her hand in mine, out in the open, exactly where it belonged. The people around us that night were different. Warm in the way that doesn't cost anything because it isn't being performed. They laughed without calculation. They listened without agenda. They saw Sungmin and me, not as a contrast, not as something requiring explanation, just two people who had made something real and were living inside it. Near the end of the evening, Sungmin gave a brief, unscripted speech. He thanked the sponsors. He talked about what it means to build something with intention. And then at the very end, without any rehearsal, he looked directly across the room at me and said, "Every good thing that has happened to me in the last 2 years has her at the center of it." Room applauded. I smiled. Not for the room. For my mother, sitting right beside me with tears gathering at the corners of her eyes that she had absolutely no intention of letting fall. We had both been waiting a long time for a room that felt like this. And if this story made you feel something, hit that like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe because there are more stories where this one came from. And trust me, you are not going to want to miss what comes next.